Welcome to another Boundless Live AI Accountability. Andrej, Emre, it's great to see you. Let's roll the Boundless credits and then we're going to jump in and have this conversation. It's great to see you both. Thank you so much for joining us on this live stream today. Emre, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name's Emre Kazim. I'm a research fellow in the Department of Computer Science at University College London. Although I'm in the computer science department, my background is actually in philosophy. I did my PhD in philosophy. I did it in ethics, and I found myself in amongst engineers, where initially my work was to kind of translate what was taking place in the humanities into the engineering department. But now it's become a bit more 180, where I look at what's happening in engineering and try to communicate that to the non-engineering communities.
Wow, the communicator, the bridge, the interpreter.
The conduit.
The conduit, yes. And Andrej, what about yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm currently finishing up my PhD in AI ethics and law. It's a double degree between university. It's an Erasmus European research project. So double degree between University of Bologna in Italy and University of Luxembourg. And it's both in computer science, which is, let's say, it's an auxiliary part, let's say, and the main part is also is in philosophy and ethics. So yeah, I'm finishing that up, and basically I'm starting my search for job, and that's it.
Wonderful.
And similar to that, I'm working on from the other side, right? So from the philosophy part, I'm trying to go to engineers and tell them, just there is something that exists outside of your algorithms, So, yeah.
Well, we're in good company today. It's Friday afternoon here in the UK, so we can have a leisurely conversation. Our topic, it's rolling at the bottom, and we're looking forward to some questions and contributions this afternoon. Bridget's already logged in saying, hello, Emre. I think Bridget booked you, didn't she, for her One Society event?
Hi, Bridget. Yes, wonderful, Bridget. Thank you, Bridget.
And we're all about giving platforms here. So I've been trying to get my head around this accountability in AI, because that sounds like a massive subject. We spent countless hours trying to get our heads around ethics in these communities. And I know you both do a lot of work around that and publish a lot of work around that. Then there's trust, then there's transparency. And I think some things get lost in translation here, don't they? Because transparency isn't about just turning over your code, is it? Or having to share your IP. And, ethics isn't just about this kind of code of conduct, is it? So these are really difficult concepts. So kind of parking some of that for a moment, what does accountability mean? Kick us off with that terminology.
So in itself, I guess you have to be, it's accountability, I suppose, is, you can think of it in a number of ways. One way is to say who is accountable or what is accountable. But when I say who is accountable, you can think of an individual. You can think of an individual being responsible for their own actions. But you can also think of, when I say who, we've got now kind of legal status of companies. And we've also got this debate emerging about the legal status of algorithms, about whether or not you can ascribe personhood to an algorithm, or you can, in the same way as you ascribe a kind of responsibility to a company, can you do that to algorithms? So that's the kind of question of who and what. And then, of course, it's accountable according to what standards. So most of the time when we talk about accountability, I think we have a number of, if you will, let's say external criteria that we think of as you need to be accountable towards. In the kind of family home, you might be accountable to your mum. In a more general sense, you might be accountable to society. That might not be a legal form of accountability. It may be that there's reputational damage for a company if they don't perform particularly well. So there is a kind of accountability that isn't legally rooted, but generally speaking, we're talking about legal accountability. There are already laws. There are already a whole bunch of laws that you can apply to companies or systems that deploy or the deployment of AI systems. But now there's a big, vibrant debate about whether or not there should be new laws or there should be amending of laws. What kind of codified statutory guidelines or standards or whatever you want to call it are the thing that you're accountable according to. So the one side is what's the standard, and the other side is who's actually accountable or what's accountable. So that's the kind of space that we're in when in the AI accountability framework.
Andrej, is it just a legal procedure here? Do you see this as just governance from the top down, or does accountability run deeper than that, do you think?
Well, there is the additional side the other side of moral accountability, right? So, as Emre said, you can be accountable to your mom in your home, right? So, also there is a moral accountability towards your, let's say, for your community as well, and the wider society. I mean, that the legal and the moral perspectives, let's say, they intertwine and they spread out everywhere. The thing is that there is one, I would say, a problem issue that people oftentimes conflate these terms like accountability, responsibility, liability, culpability. All these are conflated often, and they mean similar things, but they're not exactly the same. So, for example, let's say we make the difference between accountability and responsibility, right? So someone who is responsible is needs to respond to to particular situations, processes, right, etc. But when these things are performed at the end, then accountability comes into question. So if something is instantiated in particular sense, like someone who was responsible to see the end of something, and then that something is not pushed through to the end, then that guy or woman, whatever, he is responsible. He's accountable on what he did or he didn't do. So accountability is particular to the individual, what they were supposed to do or not, and responsibility is in a general sense like a process thing. So when we separate these things, we can understand actually what accountability, how accountability pertains to algorithms, right? And a little part of accountability can be ascribed to algorithms, but in general, it is ascribed to their deployers, users, etc., and even engineers, right? Yeah.
And if we zone out from the micro to the macro for a minute, there's always these parallels, isn't there, between what's really happening in business and what's happening in the detail around some technologies. And there are differences. I mean, AI is not the same as bioscience, which is not the same as running an ethical business. But the heart of this is an idea of responsibility and care. And so we should see businesses transform quite a bit. I can't see that beyond about 5 or 10 years, there can really be any more of this kind of mea culpa approach to business that says, but we're a corporation, shareholder value, fiduciary obligation, it's about the bottom line, and that's kind of where we go. So businesses will have to step up, won't they, Emre? They will have to take responsibility.
So it's a great question. I think it's also the way you framed it is really on point. I think we're in a really dynamic phase because it's not settled. There are these kind of positions. Let's say, for example, I think probably the closest development was data privacy in terms of this kind of ethical concern that emerged, and then all of the kind of industry and the structure of governance that has evolved as a result of it. So there are these things called data protection officers. I remember there was in the IEEE published some gargantuan report on AI ethics. I think it was 2017, and they were postulating things like a chief value officer, and that was in the time when there was all these discussions about having these AI ethical principles, and it was kind of reflective of that. I'm looking at kind of there's risk officers in a company. There's different kinds of governance structures at the moment, and a lot of the time it's going to be interesting given the nature of the problem about how it's going to settle. But yes, I mean this is it in the sense of it all depends on who pushes, what the kind of, if you will, not just rewards or the punishments are. And I have no doubt that there are going to be, it all depends. We've been speculating a lot on the regulatory intervention, whether it's going to come in a hard-handed way or if it's going to be very light touch. A lot of these things are going to have profound implications on the nature of the way in which AI governance or risk assessment is going to occur. I think it's unsettled at the moment, and that's why it's so dynamic. That's why I was just picking up on how you framed it in terms of it seems to be unsettled. But absolutely, I've been thinking a lot about, let's say that we've talked about a data protection officer, a risk officer, for example, compliance officer, etc. And you've picked up the point about, how culpable are the developers of these systems? How culpable are they morally culpable? A horrible term to use, an individual responsibility, and so on and so forth. So that's a big question, and I've seen some work taking place here, where there's been like surveys of developers or data scientists, etc., saying, how do you feel about this? And in these kind of surveys, some people are saying we're really concerned. So you're seeing, for example, in some major companies, staff talking about walking out when they're not comfortable with a particular type of product or particular stance that the company is taking. That's very interesting. Others are saying we just want to know what the criterion is. You get this a lot from the engineering community, so that we can just ensure that we're doing what is right according to some whatever democratically ratified standard or whatever it may be. And I do respect that position. It's not a kind of suspension of their own moral responsibility, but it's to say that as a community we've come to these standards. So there's interesting work on the individual level on how the if you will, the real agents here are those who are actually developing these things. Because even if it's not a trivial task to create kind of very powerful algorithms. These things, they take a lot of effort and resource, but a lot of brilliance as well. So that's that's a very interesting question. Yeah, go for it, Andrej.
Right. Well, if I can pitch in, I mean, yeah. All right. So, yeah, I mean, for example, there is I don't know. Well, I've worked, for example, in PricewaterhouseCoopers in PwC a while ago, and they're responsible for example, for audits, right? They deal in audits and professional services, and there is currently a non-profit organization in the United States that I just joined as a contributor. It's called For Humanity, so it's conjoined, like For Humanity. You can find it on LinkedIn and everywhere, and it deals exactly with that. It wants to develop the criteria. It's like a questionnaire audit of algorithms and automated systems, which will be used by, let's say, professional audit organizations, which deal with auditing of algorithms, and companies that create algorithms and deploy algorithms, and not just algorithms, and robots and stuff like that. And they will go through this questionnaire like an audit, and they will have clear set criteria, which will count as points, and at the end you calculate the score of compliance with these rules. So that is a good, let's say, development in that sense, for which we already have experience of financial audits, right? So PwC, Deloitte, and all the others do this for several decades now. So this approach is one kind of approach that might be I think it should be taken into consideration, right?
So it's actually interesting because the area of research that I'm engaged in is assurance and auditing of algorithmic systems,
right?
And it's interesting because let's take an example of the February white paper, the EU white paper. on AI. What was it? The AI, trustworthy AI, whatever it was, landscape. Or whatever.
I guess. Yeah.
And that was interesting because that was a very, I read that as a very, when I say political, I don't mean political in the sense of polemic. I mean political in the sense that it was written by major stakeholders. That was interesting because it was by quite a bit of industry, and there was quite a lot of publicity on it, and it was somewhat negatively received. And it was negatively received in the framework of it stifling innovation, despite the fact that it just constantly spoke about it. In terms of what it was actually proposing with its risk structure, people were worried about that. And what was interesting is that in 2018, there was a high-level expert group on trustworthy AI or whatever it was. Yeah, and that publication in 2018 had a whole bunch of lists of questions for different verticals. So things like, when you're assessing fairness, what do we mean by that? For example, is the if-then kind of things which could be codable. And they've just released another updated version of that same document, I think a month ago or so. And it's interesting because the experts, if you will, in that community, a lot of them are engineers. So the assessment aspect of it, I'm very keen as a non-engineer to ensure that the engineers are able to say, hey, everyone, this is just unreasonable. And that doesn't mean that people often take that as the market is trying to ensure that there's light touch on auditing or assurance. No, sometimes actually it's just unreasonable. Like as in it's just not going. We're just gonna be leapfrogged by China or the United States and so on and so on. There's a whole kind of geopolitical aspect to it as well. So I'm keen to have the engineers involved saying, is this reasonable? Is this unreasonable? How burdensome is this for this to be done? Because another thing is, inadvertently, again, despite what the white paper was saying, it's just going to lead to AI innovation, in quotes, only being done by massive companies that can afford to have the whole kind of legal compliance and risk sorted. So that's a super interesting space. Sometimes I don't know if we should call it audit or assurance. It's an emerging field, and we're very active in that space.
Right. Well, they call it audit, but it might be called assurance. I don't know.
Let me hop in a second, gents, before we continue this conversation. Just a few hellos here. We got Tushar saying hello, Chuman, Akko as well, Kuna. We got a couple of questions. I've got some of my own, but let's serve our audience here first. So, great. An easy one for Kunal, who says, "What are we talking about?" Well, that's an easy one. We're talking about accountability.
The robots are taking over.
We're not talking about robots.
Jesus Christ,
right. We're trying to stay the right side of deep philosophy today. And so, Kunal, it's rolling on the screen there as well if you want to take a look at our topic. So let's put Akko's question up. What do you think are the most important strategic areas of AI for the countries? So I guess he wants to scale out on this in terms of the conversation and who should be responsible for their development. To add my own spin on that as well, I mean, it does get complex, doesn't it? You're talking about big enterprises there, footprints in loads of countries, loads of laws. You're talking about engineers walking out potentially when their views and the company's views don't match. I wonder how that happened. I mean, they interviewed, they knew a lot about the company. So companies obviously changing, aren't they? Developing, moving their position across the whole world. Shine some light on that for us.
Do you want to go for it?
Yeah. Well, what are the most important or strategic areas for AI for the countries? Well, I would say defense is definitely one, but please note defense, not attack. So I'm talking about defensive strategic, let's say, approach here, and also cybersecurity, right, and data protection and stuff like that. So employing strategic artificial intelligence resources to ensure data protection, automated anti-hacking or whatever, anti-breach systems etc., will help tremendously with not only compliance from the sense of data protection, but also will help in practice, right? So it will act in a sense of also of a deterrent, but also it will act in a sense of a barrier, right? So a very, very strict and narrow but very effective barrier against data breaches and stuff like that. So also I would say I'm struggling I'm trying to find the word here for the well, the capitalization, right? So we have, for example, huge corporations and companies such as Google or Microsoft and all these that are able to push ahead and push ahead the curve, and they are very difficult it's very difficult for other companies which don't have the resources to catch up, right? So the states in this sense, just like they do with let's say two big companies and banks and stuff like that, to ensure competition and stuff like that. I think that the states will have to have a role here as a strategic approach to ensure competition in this space, and also explainability and also openness and stuff like that. So I would point out these three areas. Yeah.
So you're just jumping in there, and now that's really interesting because I think so. It was the two examples that you gave are really important in terms of conditions for a flourishing AI innovation kind of environment. Security and data. And it's interesting because I know that the EU published a data strategy, and I know I think it was either I don't know when it was. It was a presidential decree. I don't know if it was early. I think it may have been early this year, or anyway, in the last year or so, maybe end of 2019. And the US, there was a presidential order. I'm not sure what it's called exactly. That Trump signed, which was that data as a national resource, or data as a national as a kind of national security issue. And there's a lot of work, and I think it's really on point of standardizing data lakes and so on and so forth. And that way, you can give access to kind of small, innovative companies. Another example is the university researchers, or other researchers who are doing, if you will, using it for good, they may not have the same proprietary kind of structures, or situated in a less kind of commercial sense. It's also a source for them. It can become a massive national resource. And you can imagine if it's done properly, imagine you've got a highly kind of high quality data national resource. And there's some interesting kind of ethical questions there. So we've already got, in most countries, some of the best data kept are in, for example, financial data. So the treasuries in various countries have the most well-verified kind of data with respect to financial truths, if you will, of people and companies. Another thing is obviously the ethical implications of national health data, or national services that have these kind of health data. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of kind of ethics there, but there's a lot of ethics in different directions. What is it to use it, and what is it not to use it? Because I can see people are noting things like healthcare, security, finance, etc. And I think Akko has just said, where should we invest? Honestly, I don't, because I'm not occupying that position. For me, it's a more interesting question to say, how do we have the structures in place, if you will, or how do we put things into position where we enable certain things to emerge? Probably I wouldn't worry too much about massive investments in X or Y. And I always say this as someone positioned in the university: just give it to some foundational researchers. But more generally, what are the structures that we need to have in place that enable these things? And as you said, security, data lakes, and so on and so forth. All of these things, if they're done well at the start, it's just very enabling for other things to emerge.
True. Well, Atso also asked, I mean, so he says, so interesting question is, who should and will take care of that? Profit-oriented companies, or it's a government responsibility? I would say both. both. I mean, yeah, that the government has its own responsibility. The profit-oriented companies have, let's say, a goal to make profit, but they also should be responsible. Like they need to have corporate social responsibility, right? They should be responsible to the wider society. It's not just them. It's not just their profit. They're also responsible for. I mean, they exist to provide goods and services that the society needs.
It's
So,
also
yeah.
there's an element here of risk. So a lot of the time, why do we ask for the market to do something? We say that look, there's an upside that comes with what you're doing. So if you're going to spend lots of money, I don't know, putting money into R&D or doing kind of experimental stuff and so on and so forth, then it's very risky. And companies can justify that, right? They're not taking money off taxpayers. And that's for me a very interesting thing, because I wonder, I really do wonder about how, and people are really, I agree with people's concerns. It's obvious, isn't it strange? Isn't it sad, like weird that there's like 4 or 5 companies that are dominating, the entire kind of, let's call it the digital landscape. And they're so powerful that all they have to do is, you just have to be a small company that's doing okay, and then they'll just come and acquire you. So there are serious questions about whether or not the traditional logic of the market is being compromised by monopolization through sheer financial might and reach. So I don't have an answer in an immediate sense to that, because I think that there are significant political consequences, social and political consequences of this kind of thing. How do people feel about monopolies? What does it mean to even say to a company that you have to give up your data? I mean, if then what are we creating? This, are we going for a command economy now? So
No,
there are,
definitely not.
So I do think that this is a big question that's very, very difficult. It's a very non-trivial way of responding to it, because it's not a market as people think of it is a market. And also it's just the expertise and competencies. I mean, anybody who works in a computer science department will just see that, the people working on your desk, after a few years, they end up in some of these amazing, huge companies. And why wouldn't they? They can do the same research. They can do the same thing without the need to apply for grants every 3 to 6 months or whatever it may be. So it's not. I just want to present the argument that it's not the traditional market, but it's not necessarily at the micro level, because people have just become evil, or they're selling out and moving into the space. But there's kind of very powerful economic reasons why this is occurring.
True. Well, believe me, I mean, I come originally from a country that had a command economy in the past, and it ended in the disaster. So it was Yugoslavia. So that kind of an experiment is well, let's say it's proven wrong, right? It's proven ineffective. On the other side, the freer the market, the more it will end up in huge monopolies. So without regulations in place, monopolies are, I would say, even a natural thing to develop, right? So where the answer is, it's somewhere somewhere in between, but not towards the command economy thing. Maybe a little bit towards the free market, right?
It's interesting. So two aspects of it. Let's call these kind of rivals. So one is the purchasing power of a government, and just how much influence that they can have on innovation and industry. So the UK government, as well as other governments, I know that there was some work done by, what was it? I forgot the name of the organization. It's one of those, multinational organizations, and it's not the UN or whatever it is, but they published some procurement guidelines. And that was really interesting, because the procurement guidelines can, because the government is such a powerful economic force, they can effectively dictate to the market what how products should be developed, how transparent they should be, how much interoperability there has to be, for example, and so on and so forth. So that's one big aspect of it. That's a big stakeholder that has a lot of agency that doesn't have to be through pure centralization, but just through its kind of economic, just its purchasing power. Another element is the academy. So the academy is purportedly a kind of more neutral space. I always find it funny. Yeah, I always find it funny because my fellow academics always kind of wax lyrical about, they're just morally condemning and waving their fingers. And I always say, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest. Are we not a interest group? Do we not have a series of interests and a series of, our own agenda, if you want to call it that, without it sounding nefarious? But let's say in a kind of idealized sense, there is something called the academy, something where there is an integration into an education system that develops over time and so on.
Sure.
So that's something that's another big player, another big stakeholder in this space. And like I said, it's not easy to find people or to train people to the extent to which you would need. You look at what these big companies are doing. They're coming and taking members of faculty from these places. So as in, like, they're not, bringing them up themselves. Obviously, maybe it's in time, maybe they're going to have their own universities. That's something I've been hearing people talk about a lot, actually, because there's some, we saw, for example, how DeepMind were acquired by Google, for example, and that's a massive research program. If when you interact, it feels like a university. It feels like they're doing real research, foundational research. So I'm not sure, but the academy is a serious stakeholder here. There's a lot of like brilliant minds. There's a lot of investment that goes into that done correctly or strategically, it can be a very significant player in the whole innovation and national strategy, national economic strategy and governance, and so on and so forth.
Let me steer this a little bit, because we were talking about countries, continents, regions, companies, and the difference. Let me ask you this: where would you rather be in terms of innovation? Then you've got China, the ultimate command and control state, massive tech companies, Baidu, Tencent, and then you've got US. In theory, a much freer state, democratic state, obviously massive, biggest three in the world, Apple, Microsoft, Google. Then you've got Europe, and it puts us in a unique position, doesn't it? That we haven't got a tech giant akin to any of those I've just named. So the lobbying must be less. Surely that gives us a little bit more freedom and opportunity, doesn't it? Around data, openness, new laws.
Very interesting point, because you can flip the question that you've made, the question that you've posed, and said, is it, this is, I'm just speculating here, but is it a negative thing that we haven't produced one of the leading companies in the world?
Well, why haven't we? I mean, is it
yeah,
innovation? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I look at, I'm very interested in, I think we've got a lot of brilliant research taking place here. We've got some of the leading minds. I have no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder about, it could be a cultural thing. People often talk about, you've got these you've got these figures, let's call them figures without naming names, who are like becoming really anti-academia. And their argument is, you've got a brilliant idea, you've got a brilliant idea for business or research or whatever it may be, just commercialize it, create a company, and a huge amount of innovation just results as a consequence of that. And usually in the West Coast of the States, people talk about the kind of timelines as being weeks or a month rather than months and a year, as is the case for, say, startups in Europe. But that's a cultural thing. It's about cultural risk averseness, or maybe that, I'm not sure. That's one aspect of it when we're talking about our relationship with the United States. Do we have that kind of culture where it's like, let's do this, let's make this happen, I'm willing to risk, blah, blah, blah. The Chinese example I find really, really interesting, because it's almost always spoken about in terms of national security, and also spoken about in terms of kind of not just the competitiveness with the United States is economic, whereas it feels like the competitiveness with China is spoken of more in terms of geopolitical competitiveness. I think we don't know. Obviously, I don't know, but I think a lot of innovation is taking place in China. I think they're totally. It could be a bit. I hate to use the phrase, but sometimes it might be a bit bigoted. The way people think that they just copy. They just copy. I don't
think it's an old-fashioned view, actually.
I don't think so. I think there's some serious innovation and think is coming out of that space. And maybe it's a bit of hubris on our side to think that the Chinese are doing this because they're able to copy better or and so on and so forth. I think there's some serious, real. We need to think very seriously about when the United States side, is it something to do with culture? And when we're talking about losing to, let's say, China, is that more to do with, are we investing in the right way? Are we thinking of this in the geopolitical sense of how important it is for us to be right on the ball when it comes to AI innovation? Sorry for my long-winded answer.
Well, I would add to that the thing is that with for example the EU or Europe, it's a lot more diverse and less unified than both United States and China, right? So there is no that kind of top-down, streamlined, guidelines or execution, administrative execution. There are so many, let's say, different stakeholders from different countries that are in the EU, right? And they all have to agree on something. For example, it doesn't have that doesn't happen in China. Certainly, it doesn't happen. I mean, it's the Communist Party, and whatever it enacts, it has to be executed, right? And similar in the United States, because it's a single unified country with let's say, a unified nation, its administration is a lot more efficient in applying whatever was enacted at the top level, right, and at the parliament level or whatever. And I think that it's similar to the what was the term, the division of powers, I would say, like the parliament, and then you have the government, and then you have the judges, right? So the legal system, the judicial system, right? So when you have different stakeholders which are at odds to each other, you have this kind of a let's say you can. It's hard for a dictator to arise, right? Because you have this all control of different powers that push or pull in their side. So this is what happens in EU and in Europe, which doesn't happen at that level in the United States and China. So I guess that's why they are so advanced in innovation. But I would say that the fairness, the transparency of innovation in Europe is by far ahead than in the United States and China.
Yeah, but it's interesting because so one of what do they make the jokes that the US invents, China copies, and the EU regulates. And the thing is, that's great if that's the position that we want to take as Europeans. But I guess the idea is that don't we want to be leading innovators? Like, as in, are we? And the thing is, I think that we can be. I actually think that it's not. I think we have the capacity. We have brilliant researchers. We have I agree that there is this kind of people speaking different languages, people from different kind of research institutions and historically speaking. And I actually think that's a positive because then it's just very dynamic. But there's also research enabling regulation and standards. So I was looking at this. There was some work done by in the UK solicitors regulator, and they found that they were reviewing. It's kind of interesting to see solicitors reviewing legal or regulatory interventions on some stuff on the use of algorithms for I think dispute resolutions, or I forgot what it was. And they found that no regulation wasn't good because people just thought, well, when we enter into this market, is there, like, as in we're just scared because we have no guidance whatsoever. Too much regulation obviously was bad, but they found that there was a kind of mean where there was a space where you can there's a kind of sweet spot where you can just enable particular types of that actually is an enabling form of regulatory intervention.
Just like taxation, like with taxation, right?
Yeah,
Sweet
yeah,
spot.
yeah. So and I think that we're spending a lot of time on and sometimes that puts us behind on our kind of regulatory interventions. Or if there should be regulatory intervention, you might say GDPR took God knows how long. Or someone might say, oh, look how quickly we came to it. But then it became the premier form of or the standard of data privacy globally. And that's important. That opens up a whole bunch of markets to European companies. A whole industry emerges as a result of that. So I take the point. I certainly take the point. It doesn't have to be. Europe doesn't have to be validated by Europe. By the way, I'm saying we're here in the UK is the same thing.
Let's not start that conversation.
I meant the geographic continent.
Right.
Yeah, I meant the geographic continent. But my point is more that I take the point that we don't have to be validated by saying we haven't produced a Google or we haven't produced an Amazon. I take the point.
I'm glad you've said that, and I just want to point out something you've said there as well. That regulation is not anti-innovation, and when we look at the financial industry, the regulations changes they make are incredible. They make companies adapt. They spring up new startups who see new ways of approaching the market, and of course, it's made possible the most fantastic thing of all, open banking, which is a pathway to millions and potentially billions more people having access to financial products.
Yeah.
So let's just say hello to a couple of people that have commented here as well. Hassam said hello. Bridget's been back on. Niraj is here. Great to see you. Anmol. So let me just do a quick one here for Anmol. He says, can you give an example of Chinese AI innovation? Now,
I don't know. Does TikTok count?
I think TikTok does count, and the way that they build communities is really different and interesting to places like Instagram. The one I would add to that is Ant Financial. And now I won't talk too much about it, but you can do your own research. Have a look at their carbon footprint app. They have innovated like crazy.
Well, it might not be ethical. It might not be ethical, but their facial recognition stuff,
Exactly.
What, again, in TikTok or just generally?
Well, I mean,
you're steering me down a path here. You sure?
Yeah, my mum's Turkish, so I'm, I was going to talk about the Uyghurs there for a second, but let's not go there.
Well, again, it's worth just mentioning that. I mean, again, we're not trying to put cross political viewpoints on this live stream, but
no.
do your own research to come to your own conclusions. I'm glad you brought that up, Emre. Andrej, looks like you have something you want to add.
Well, it's something that relates to the facial recognition is, what about their social credit system, right? So
yeah,
that is an AI, a very advanced AI system, I would say. I mean, it's automated and everything, but whether it's moral or ethical, that's the question.
So, and another thing, actually, I'd say, just to bring it back to what we're up to here in Europe and the UK in particular, is we got a big program of government digital transformation and digitalization of government services. And actually, there's some really good examples of I won't talk about AI necessarily. Let's talk about it, automation. You can have automation of I'm thinking of some case studies, not in the UK. I have one case study in mind. I won't go into the details of it, where the pensions people were going and just lining up for their pensions. And there was a joke in that country that people would just die, in the middle of the winter as they waited for, So, it's a bit of a morbid humor, but there was this absurd, you got grannies and granddads in the freezing cold waiting to pick up this kind of week, and now they've just automated it. It just goes straight to the bank accounts. So this kind of government digital transformation, and then the kind of use, and that's more just basic digitization. And then there's things like an automation, and then there's things like the chat box. Everyone's complaining about bureaucracy and all the rest of it, and then you've got access to something that responds, or so they're hoping to use these things in interactive and dynamic fashions, which is more the use of, or say, AI systems, which can provide kind of services for people. So that's a big, a huge aspect of it, again, that the government can be involved in, and they're going to set the highest standards, of course, in terms of their provisions and their use of it, and then they'll go through huge amounts of kind of testing and validating before that would happen.
Let's throw this question up here from Hessam, and I want to put an angle on this as well. Is that he's talking about oil, and we see the oil, gas, coal companies going through a huge amount of transformation. BP being a classic example of this. Shell looking to do some similar things, start an energy company, potentially losing. Well, they are going to lose about 12% of their workforce by 2022. So, my question actually on this is: if we roll the clock forward 10 to 15 years, could you see big tech going through the pressures that big oil is going through now? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Well, it's interesting because the way you've asked it was striking to me, because I thought about, we're seeing one industry on the decline, if you will. But we think of this big tech as, in a way, maybe even a stronger position.
Yes, but
yeah. So yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure. It's really, I'm always think about the dynamism of some of these companies. You know, you think about the kind of the not monopoly, but the dominance of company X in the 90s. You know, I think you probably know which companies I'm referring to, and then just how that changes. And then you've got, I'll mention it because they're market leader. Let's say Apple, and I think it feels like to us, how would Apple be knocked off the pedestal? But then I think I can see a superior kind of phone product quite readily. Not readily, but I can see that coming up. I can see that changing. It's not. They're so dominant on one hand. On the other hand, it doesn't look like a supremely difficult problem to solve.
Well, let's just say that innovation isn't just in product, though. Innovation could be in the way they treat their employees, and innovation could be in decentralization of data. An Apple that's completely decentralized, a Twitter that's completely decentralized would be a very different proposition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a huge amount of political. There's a lot of political elements to this. I think about that. I think about all of on the one hand, there was all these calls to boycott Facebook, for example, and just keeps growing. It just keeps as in it just goes from strength to strength. You've got Zuckerberg in the being pulled up on national TV and chastised, and it having almost no impact on the company in negative presses. It almost feels like, yeah. Sorry.
Well, let's ask about that, Andrej, because Bridget said politics and ethics, and there's a great moment here because someone like Trump has set about by saying, you're not going to catch me out by catching me out. There's a little bit of that with Zuckerberg as well. They sort of set their stall, don't they? Elon Musk as well. They seem to have these strategies now, these people, that they look at what's going to hurt them down the road, and they attack it head on at the beginning in a political way to save themselves. Facebook constantly in the news, obviously in the news again with the Oculus Quest 2 and the fact that you have to log into Facebook to access some or all of the features to make it the best experience, privacy questions there. And they were one of these companies 10 years ago where they said, we're going to store users' data indefinitely. Even if you leave the platform, we're going to hold on to your data indefinitely. And various countries in Europe said you can't do that, and they ignored it. It took the whole of Europe, Andrej, to stop Facebook doing that. The whole of Europe versus Facebook. And that was 10 years ago.
True.
Could Europe even do that now? Is Europe strong enough to tell Facebook what to do?
Oof. It depends. I don't know. I mean, if they really wanted to, I guess they could in theory, but I don't know. It's well, you see, Facebook just recently, I think this was a news, I don't know, several days ago, the Facebook stated that they would stop providing their services for the EU if they're not allowed to keep data, and if they are forced to keep data on European servers, right? For example, in Ireland or whatever, instead of transferring that data to the United States, right? So they threaten to leave, in a sense, to block access to their services if they're not allowed to do this. And I think that lobbying takes a large part of the background politics here, right? So they issue public statements and people cheer for this side or that side, but in the background, they're working together to get some kind of a solution that, in theory, is coherent with the, let's say, with the regulations that already exist, for example, from the European Commission or whatever, And at the same time, it seems to be coherent, but at the same time, it allows big companies such as these, who have lobbied a lot, not just in brain power, but also in money power, to be able to continue to work, because there is a big money also in all this. So I don't know. In theory, yes, but in practice, the politics in the background that goes on, it's a dirty job, let's say.
Yeah, I don't know, because if only I was powerful and important enough to be lobbied.
You will
to have someone to have someone to lobby to. But it's interesting that I agree that this is. I was talking to a scholar from Zimbabwe last week, and he was talking about this very strongly. He was saying, look, we want to own our data. We see this as an enabling factor. So he's based in the University of Cape Town, and he was talking about this. He was saying, no, this is a resource for us. We know that this is a resource. We're not here just for it to be captured and there be no consequences to it. And he was even pushing this in the context of saying, a lot of ethical discussions are about bias. This algorithm is misogynistic, or this algorithm it only takes, Anglo-Saxon names or whatever it may be. Saying that these pale in insignificance in compared to, you're talking about huge, vast amounts of wealth transfer effectively, or value transfer rather, and then it becomes commercialized. So it's a very, very important point. I just wonder what that means in terms of citizen agency. I've seen the proliferation of a lot of NGOs emerge in this space. Maybe that's the route to form these kind of communities or these institutions that sit as lobbying forces on behalf of the citizenship. I guess the traditional way is that some political party comes along and says, I really care about this, and then people go and vote for them. But so it's interesting to see. I'm very non-committal on what should be done. I don't know. I think at this time there's just so much activity taking place. We saw all that stuff with the AI ethics principles, where like everyone just published a set of principles, and then it never went anywhere. They were just
some great debate. Yeah. Well, I look at climate change, I look at AI as well, and I think finally we're seeing accountability in climate change. I think people are stepping up now and doing things. It's late, and I think it took us so long to do that in the climate. And if we leave it that long in AI, these kind of conversations around data and privacy and storage, explainability, responsibility, if we just keep pushing this back. I mean, look at AR and VR. We touched on it. These new kingdoms. Talk about monopolies. There could be some huge monopolies in augmented reality. In fact, there probably will be. We better guide this conversation to a close. We haven't touched Niraj's question. Let's make this our final one, and then we'll put a pin in today's conversation. And it's a good summary actually of what we've been trying to get at today. AR algorithms are complex. Yes, they are, and they're certainly difficult sometimes to explain. So autonomous decision-making is sometimes likened to a black box. Yes, it can be. So is it difficult to hold humans legally accountable? Well, let's summarize today, and let's answer that question as we do so. Emre, do you want to start that one? And then, Andrej, do you want to take us home?
Yeah. So interesting. Two aspects of it, I guess. One is, are they black box systems? So there's a lot of people who are saying there's some systems that are saying it's almost impossible for us to know how it's coming to its results. Fine. But there's a huge amount of engineering literature now that challenges the idea of complete and utter opacity or black box systems. As in, it's not really, if you're going to use AI, then then it's necessarily going to be black box. So that's the first thing, and that's important. I think it's important that the engineers have spoken and said, no, actually there is such a thing as this whole branch of engineering, AI engineering, called explainability, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's the one aspect. Another thing, this is just purely a speculative point, and we published this article about a week ago We wrote it with a judge, and it was a conversation I had with the judge, and I said to him, we're looking at historical data and some judgments, let's say, and they look biased. And when you read the individual judgments, they look perfectly reasonable. No judge is publishing saying, I'm putting this person into prison because they're black. But you look at the aggregate thing and it's horrible. So you've got a distinction between how the individual consciousness of their performance and the actual performance itself. So the argument was, is human cognition a black box? And why does that matter? Because when you're evaluating how unethical an algorithm is, it's comparative. It's a comparative analysis. So, the first thing is, engineering-wise, there's this thing called explainability. It's a big issue. And secondly, it's compared to what? If you're in, I always tell people this: if you're in a system and you've got one that's horribly biased, an algorithm isn't going to make it worse. Like as in the algorithm isn't the problem, if you will. It's like, why is this thing constantly? Why is this phenomena of discrimination occurring? That didn't become invented by the algorithm. So just to make the point about the black box issue is different from both a philosophical perspective, psycho-philosophical, and from an engineering perspective. There's a lot of nuance there. But yeah, just to probably wrap up. What was the wrapping? Just that's me wrapping up, saying, yeah, it's this question of accountability is a human phenomena. It's a socially generated demand that we make from people as a result of various kind of cultural and social norms that we have, and rightly so. Accountability has evolved with time, and when we call upon accountability, it's necessarily a public political phenomena. So we think of algorithms within that, if you will, debate, rather than just what's the accountability of algorithms themselves.
Oh my word, Emre, you've dropped the mic, but Andrej, pick that mic up again.
Can I
grab it off the floor for me for a second?
Can I pick it up? Yeah. All right. All right. Thanks, Emma. That was you actually went into some really good subjects in this sense, in this context. So that example about human moral decision making and decision making in general, is it a black box, right? So it is actually. You cannot see the neurons inside and what they do in a particular human, right? Aside from being technically impossible for now, it's also immoral, right? I mean, people have private thoughts. Why should you be able to read their thoughts and everything? But at the same time, let's say we're talking about algorithms here and automation, right? And the thing is that it's similar to how parents are accountable and responsible for the actions of their children, right? And legally also liable, right? So the thing is, you as a parent, let's say me as a parent, because I have two kids, you have to be, let's say, you cannot enter your kid's mind. You have to see how they act in the world, act out, or what they talk, what they speak, and judge from there and compare and make a theory of their mind, right? And actually figure out what they're thinking. And you do the same thing for people that you meet. You do the same thing for politicians, for judges, for everyone. And judges do this for criminals before them, and such. So we see how algorithms or automated systems act, and we deem their designers, their employers, their users accountable and responsible for what they do. It doesn't matter if it's a black box or not. I mean, yes, deep neural networks are a kind of black box. You cannot understand exactly what they do, right? But expert systems, you can understand exactly what they do, how they reach their conclusion, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's black box or not. Who is responsible? Who is accountable again? And whether they took all the necessary precautions and effort to make that system as unbiased as it could be, as capable of what it advertises it to be. And I think that this is the let's say the area where we should push regulation and ethics, AI ethics, in the sense of responsibility and accountability of those that use, design, and employ these systems, not of the algorithms themselves. Yeah, they get too complex, but at the same time, they were designed by a human for now.
Andrej, Emre, thank you so much for this afternoon. We've
Thank you.
gone
Thank you,
deep
Richard.
and we've gone
Thank you,
wide.
Andrej.
What did I expect, I guess? And thank you to everybody who's joined us for all or part of the journey. I'll be uploading this conversation to the mkai.org archives and learning resources, as well, as we find these things very valuable for the community. It's been an absolute privilege to spend this time with you both. Thank you for taking some time
Thank
out
you.
of your busy
Thanks,
schedules.
Richard.
Do you want
Thank
a quick
you.
shout out where to find your work or where to follow you? Do you want a quick one-liner on that?
UCL have the worst PR kind of structures for us. It's just some kind of website. But on LinkedIn, on Twitter, just reach out.
Yeah.
I'm happy to communicate with anyone up for it, definitely. Just Google my name.
Andrej, follow you on LinkedIn?
Yeah. I mostly use LinkedIn for this kind of, let's say, for this. So please hook up on LinkedIn, add me, connect, and we'll chat.
Cool. I've heard about this LinkedIn. I might check it out. It sounds good.
Yeah.
Richard, thank you.
My
Thanks.
absolute pleasure. We'll see you all again soon. Bridget says, can we continue this conversation at Love Live? Sure. I'm sure we can make some things
Lovely.
possible. So
Yeah, we can.
You take it easy, guys, and
Thank you,
we'll
Bridget.
Have a nice guy.
we'll
Have a nice
catch up
day.
soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Take
Bye.
care.